My name is Christopher Bollyn. I'm the author of Solving 9/11 set of books. As Lou explained, there's the little book called Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World. And the larger book is the original articles that contains all my articles that I wrote about 9/11 from September 2001 through April of 2012. So what I'm going to be talking about today is basically not so much about the crime itself of 9/11, but the way that the crime has been used to bring us into the war on terror, a war that we've been in for the last 15 years, and how actually these two things fit very closely together. They come from the same source. They were done for the terror attacks of 9/11 were done in order to make the war on terror become real. The war on terror was in fact planned and prepared decades before. So 9/11 was carried out to kickstart the war on terror, which is a Zionist war agenda of aggression, terrorism, and conquest. When I use the word Zionist, I'm referring to the idea of the Jewish nationalism. That Zionism is our people. A Zionist is a person who supports the political ideology of Jewish nationalism, which is what the State of Israel is. The State of Israel was founded and promoted from the very beginning by the Rothschild family of France and in London, bankers, big bankers. So 9/11 was wrongly blamed on Muslims to trick us into supporting an open-ended and criminal war agenda across the Middle East, across the Islamic world. The fraudulent war on terror has cost the United States $2.5 trillion. That's how much we've paid already. So as good citizens, we are obliged to resist the 9/11 deception and enslavement to a criminal war agenda. I was an investigative journalist in Washington, D.C. when 9/11 happened. I wrote for a little weekly newspaper there called American Free Press. My degree is in history. My specialty is Israel and Palestine from the University of California at Santa Cruz. I'm the author of those two books, and prior to all of that, I was an Eagle Scout, and I grew up outside Chicago in a place called Schaumburg, Illinois. This is the main book, The Deception That Changed the World. Now, understanding what 9/11 was, it was a highly sophisticated false flag terror atrocity which employed something called shock and awe. Shock and awe is when you overwhelm a population with something so spectacular, so tremendous, that they are left in awe. And that was done to create fear and rage in the population, to compel us to then support the suggested war option, the war on terror. So starting the war on terror was the primary reason for the false flag terror attacks of 9/11. 9/11 itself was a policy coup that brought us the war on terror and a series of costly wars like this serious situation in Iraq, which it's interesting to note that Americans are fighting in Iraq once again today. We're still fighting there. Currently, the U.S. troops are trying to liberate the city of Mosul from Islamic State. So we've been deceived about 9/11. But 9/11 was just the beginning. The 9/11 cover-up was necessary, was required to deceive the public into supporting this open-ended war agenda against Islamic nations. We will not have peace if we allow ourselves as a nation, as a population, to remain deceived. Because if you're deceived, a nation that is deceived is a nation that's enslaved. If you follow the deception, if you accept the deception, then you will follow the escape that's provided for you to get out of that deception or to get safety, what you think is safety. So the media has imposed on the public this false story that radical Islamic terrorists are to blame for 9/11. This has been the story that we were given from the New York Times and the media from day one. And the only way to liberate ourselves and our nations from this madness, which we've been in for the last 15 years, is to expose the true source of terrorism. Now, I live most of the time in Europe, and I can tell you that in Sweden and Europe, the situation is very bad with refugees. We have the largest flows of refugees currently on the road in Sweden and Europe since World War II. Sweden does a very good job of housing them, but two summers ago, Sweden was receiving 3,000 Syrian refugees per week. It's a lot. Now, what happened on 9/11 was that the Bush administration declared the attacks to be an act of war. And that's a legal expression, because an act of war means that the the crime was not to be investigated and prosecuted as a crime. Rather, the military would be the agency that would seek justice for the crime. So there was no criminal investigation. This is something most Americans don't understand. There has not been a proper criminal investigation of 9/11. Rather, they said it's an act of war, and that night, September 11th, the Bush administration had a cabinet meeting, and they decided to go to war in Afghanistan, already that night. This is a statement by Larry Johnson, former Deputy Director of Counterterrorism at the State Department, on September 28th. He talked about this. This was in the Sun Sentinel, South Florida paper. He said they were extremely well organized. He said these guys, the 19 Arabs, were just committed zealots and willing to give it up for the cause without being key members of the network. They were told what to prepare for, what to train for. They were not the ones calling the shots. We don't have anything in history to compare with this. The only thing that comes close to it is a former Soviet intelligence operation. Now, this is a man who he was understanding already the false identities that were being used by these people in South Florida. There were 15 of the 19 Arabs lived here, and they had multiple identities. People were laying trails for them. And so this person, Larry Johnson, understood that this was a very sophisticated operation. Not something that was planned in Afghanistan. Certainly not something that was carried out by some Arab students from Germany. Now, our situation is very serious, because if the government and media are lying to us about 9/11, it means that they are controlled by the very same people who carried out 9/11. That stands to reason, because the only people who are benefiting from the cover-up are the actual culprits. A common source. Both the 9/11 terror conspiracy and the war on terror were conceived and planned in Israel in the late 1970s by Israeli military intelligence. First, a little background on the war on terror. On September 20th, 2001, President Bush declared war on terror, saying that every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you're with the terrorists. Again, the cost of the war on terror, the war fighting alone since 2001 has cost $1.7 trillion, Homeland Security about $700 billion. So it's $2.5 trillion already borrowed money laid out for the war on terror since 9/11. Now, you can imagine how far that kind of money would go on improving American infrastructure or schools, hospitals, necessary things. It's been spent in wars in which the United States has no national interest. We have no national interest in Afghanistan. We have no interest in Syria. We have no interest in Iraq. But we've spent incredible amounts of money waging war there, besides the incredible loss of life. Now, the fact of the matter is that even today, even after the Orlando shooting, an American is less likely to die from terrorism as they are from being hit by lightning. But we're spending this incredible amount of money. We're spending $400 million per year per U.S. victim of terrorism. And compare that to how much we spend on cancer victims or flu victims or heart disease, you can see that it's obscene. It's a waste. It's more than that. It's a fraud. It's a criminal fraud. The money is in this war effort. So these are some protesters, and they say the war on terror is a fraud. Of course, and the fraudulent war on terror is based on the official myth of 9/11, what we've been given by the media and by our government. But where did the war on terror come from? Well, I'm going to explain that the war on terror is an evolution of an Israeli stratagem. A stratagem is a device to trick your enemy. The war on terror is an Israeli stratagem, a ploy pushed by Benjamin Netanyahu since 1979 to trick the United States into waging war against Israel's enemies. One of the key advocates of the war on terror is Bibi Netanyahu, the current Prime Minister of Israel. He's the longest-serving Prime Minister of Israel, actually. From 76 to 78, he worked for a company called Boston Consulting in Boston, which is a Rothschild-owned company. Then in 1979, he came back to Israel and started something called the Jerusalem Institute, or the Netanyahu Institute. And the first event that they had was in July 1979, and it was called the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism. George Herbert Walker Bush spoke there. It was the July 4th weekend, and Mr. Bush was running for president, if you recall, against Ronald Reagan. And George Bush went there and attended the conference and spoke at the final session. And the purpose of this conference was to shift the propaganda, the public understanding of the threats of the world, and it went from civil rights. The switch was to international terrorism. Previously, it had been civil rights. And it's interesting, in this conference in 1979, they tried to blame the Soviet Union for all international terrorism. Now, that's important to keep in mind because, again, we see today this hostility for Russia and the former Soviet Union, which is part and parcel of the same deception. So Bibi Netanyahu made a book out of the first conference in 1979. It's called International Terrorism, Problems and Solutions, I think. Then he wrote another book. These books came out of other conferences he had. He had another conference in 1984. Terrorism, How the West Can Win, and Fighting Terrorism. So he made a career in the 80s of pushing this idea that the Western democracies, led by the United States, had to come to the Middle East to wage war against those terrorist entities who were plaguing Israel. And the logic goes something like this. He said that Israel is being attacked by these Islamic forces because they don't like Western values. And he said Israel is a piece of the West, basically, and therefore the entire West is being hit by this. So therefore the West needs to come to the aid of the outpost of Israel. And this is the same logic they use today. The father of terrorism, our modern concept of modern day terrorism actually started in Israel. And the nation was founded in 1948 very much on the back of international terrorism. And in 1974, a British journalist asked Menachem Begin, the man with the glasses, he asked him, how does it feel in the light of all that's going on to be the father of terrorism in the Middle East? And Menachem Begin, who is from Russia, said, in the Middle East, he said, in all the world. So he was taking upon himself the mantle of being the father of terrorism. He had no qualms about that. And the man in the foreground is, of course, the Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, who is today the head of the same party that Mr. Begin started back in 1973. And Menachem Begin has a long history of terrorism. He was the head of the group called the Irgun in Israel, in Palestine, pre the state of Israel. And he was responsible for the bombing of the King David Hotel. There's not many photos of it. That's his handiwork there. And Menachem Begin of the Irgun and David Ben-Gurion of the Haganah ordered the bombing, which killed 93 people, including 14 British officers. Now, this particular atrocity was the worst atrocity in Israeli-Palestinian history. It killed 93 people. But what's interesting is that it's very similar to 9/11. It was in this case, what was really occurring was not just hitting the British headquarters. It was also destroying evidence that the British had collected the previous month. And the documents and the evidence they had collected would have basically ended the Zionist enterprise in Palestine because they found that the Jewish agency was involved in terror. So they had to destroy the evidence. And 9/11 was also an act in which lots and lots of evidence was destroyed. So Begin came to Israel from Russia. He arrived in Palestine in 42. He became the leader of the Irgun in 44, and then bombed the King David Hotel in 46. He also committed something called the Deir Yassin massacre, in which an entire Palestinian village was massacred, with the people were blown up inside their houses and things like that. And this was done as a spectacle in order to compel, to persuade the other Palestinians that they better leave rather than face the fate of the people of Deir Yassin. And then he became prime minister. He created the Likud. The Likud he created with his other fellow terrorists. And in 1977, he became prime minister. And then promptly invaded Lebanon. This is the emblem of his group, the Irgun, also known as Etzel. And you can see that they have this notion of a biblical state of Israel taking up a much larger piece of land than what is today Israel. This is called Eretz Israel, or the Greater Israel. And this is the notion that people from the Likud have, that they have a God-given right to the whole biblical notion of Israel as far as it could expand at any point. So it goes into Jordan, it goes into Lebanon, goes into Egypt, goes into Iraq, even goes into Saudi Arabia. And as you can see on this emblem, it says in Hebrew at the top, Rak kach, meaning only thus. The only solution is the gun. Only with the gun will we accomplish the territory that we desire. And what's interesting, in this group, the Irgun, comes from an ideology that was promoted by a man named Zev Jabotinsky. And Zev Jabotinsky created something called the New Zionist Organization. He died in 1940, Zev Jabotinsky did. He actually wrote in 1922 that there had to be built an iron wall between the Palestinian population and the Jewish population. And that's what was built after 9/11. If you recall, in 2002, 2003, Trump wants to build his wall. Well, Mr. Ariel Sharon built his wall across the Holy Land. So if you go to Bethlehem today or Jerusalem, or if you go to the West Bank, you'll see this big wall. It's 40 times longer than the Berlin Wall and twice as high. Well, what happened when Mr. Jabotinsky died in New York City is Bibi Netanyahu's father took over that organization in New York City. And his name was Ben-Zion Milakovsky Netanyahu. So Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, has been raised in this ideology. And this is what they aspire to. This is called What Israel's Future Borders Will Look Like. It's from an Israeli website. And Menachem Begin said, after the partition plan in 1947, when the United Nations tried to partition Palestine, Menachem Begin said, the partition of Palestine is illegal. Jerusalem was and will forever be our capital. And Eretz Israel will be restored to the people of Israel, all of it and forever. Now it's important to understand that this is the doctrine of the Likud party. This is the doctrine of Menachem Begin, and this is the doctrine of Bibi Netanyahu. Hasn't changed anything. So here Begin became the prime minister in 1977. This happened to be the time when I lived in Israel. And this was an earthquake in Israeli politics because the Labor Party had been in power for 30 years prior, from the birth of Israel until this time. And then these ruthless kind of terrorist guys, they created a party and they took over. They defeated the Labor Party. And my girlfriend at the time, an Israeli labor kibbutznik, she cried. She said, this is the day that Israel died. The terrorists have taken over. So here are the troika of terrorists that took over. Menachem Begin, and on the right, Yitzhak Shamir, and on the left, Ariel Sharon. And Yitzhak Shamir, he headed another group called the Lehi, or Stern Gang. And he was responsible. His group was very, very right-wing and very militant. And they were involved in killing the United Nations envoy who was sent there to try and make peace in 1948. He was named Folke Bernadotte. He's a Swedish count there. And he was killed Bonnie and Clyde style by Yitzhak Shamir's gang outside Jerusalem. One of the members of his gang was this man's father. You might recall, this is Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago. He was also the special advisor to Bill Clinton for 8 years. And he was Barack Obama's first appointed person. He was chief of staff. And when he was chief of staff, he made a very disparaging remark about Arabs, but the media didn't seem to think that was anything, that needed to be criticized. But so Rahm Emanuel comes from that same breed, and he has that same ideology. Actually, this man, he was in America. He was working for Bill Clinton, and in 1991, he went back to Israel and served in the Israeli army during the first Gulf War as an Israeli soldier. Here are some of the original terrorists from the state of Israel: Shimon Peres, Pinhas Lavon, and Moshe Dayan. And this photograph was taken 1 month after something called the Lavon Affair. The Lavon Affair is something that's not very well understood because it's not taught in any of the courses you'll study about Zionism. The Lavon Affair was an attempt by these Israelis to divide America and Britain away from Egypt by putting bombs in libraries and cultural buildings in Egypt, in Cairo and Alexandria. And these bombs, nitroglycerin bombs, were meant to be blamed, the terrorism was meant to be blamed on the Muslim Brotherhood. And that would make America, the United States, and Britain less cozy with Nasser. But what happened is that it went wrong. Some of the bombs went off prematurely, and the Egyptian police caught some of the terrorists, and those terrorists confessed. They said they knew the other people. And some of them were hanged, several were hanged in Egypt, and some spent long prison sentences. But the men who ran the operation were these men. It was Shimon Peres on the left. He was director of the defense ministry, first man. Pinhas Lavon, the affair is named after him. He was defense minister. And then Moshe Dayan was chief of staff. And so these are the men who ran the whole operation. And they ran it as a covert operation, unbeknownst to the prime minister at the time. The prime minister at the time was a man named Moshe Sheret. And when Moshe Sheret found out, he was livid. He was the foreign minister and he was the prime minister at the time. And he absolutely despised Shimon Peres. And later he wrote in this book called Israel's Sacred Terrorism, a very good book. He wrote that Peres shares the same ideology as Lavon. He wants to frighten the West into supporting Israel's aims. And this is exactly what's going on. They're using terrorism to frighten us. Terrorism is a tool to frighten the public into being obedient and compliant with the wishes of the terrorist. So where has this taken us? This has taken us on a very bloody path. The past 15 years, the United States has basically destroyed a half a dozen nations in the Middle East, displaced millions of people who are now wandering around Europe looking for a place to live, and killed many Americans, and greatly devastated our national prosperity and prestige. It's done tremendous damage to this country. And people have to understand that this is a deception. Because when you understand the deception, then it loses its power. And we have to inform a lot of people, and it's going to take some time, but we're trying. In 1948, when Israel was being created, before the state even became a state, the Joint Chiefs of Staff wrote 13 papers about what Israel would mean to the American foreign policy. And they wrote, the 13th paper was called Force Requirements for Palestine, 1948, talking about how much military force the United States would have to send to the region. And they said in the paper, Zionist strategy will seek to involve the United States in a continuously widening and deepening series of operations intended to secure maximum Jewish objectives. And in the paper, they described two of the most important Jewish objectives were these: the expansion of Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, into Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And two, the establishment of Jewish military and economic hegemony over the entire Middle East. That's what's going on today. And in 1948, this man, he was a Rothschild employee. He came from the settlement called Rishon LeZion, which was built by the Rothschild family, means the first in Zion. Well, this man, David Ben-Gurion, told his general staff, his military people, 1 week after Israel became a state, he said, we should prepare to go over to the offensive with the aim of smashing Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. And when we smash the Arab Legion's strength and bomb Amman, we will eliminate Jordan as well, and then Syria will fall. If Egypt dares to fight on, we will bomb Port Said, Alexandria, and Cairo. So for a little nation that had just escaped annihilation, he had big plans. And he was calling for, aggressing the entire region. Some people will balk when you explain to them that Israel was involved in 9/11 and you talk about this. They'll say, "Oh no, Israel wouldn't do that." There's many Christian Zionists in this country who say, "No, Israel's our strategic ally." I would just point out they should read some history. In 1967, in the Six-Day War, on June 8th, Israeli military, Air Force, and Navy viciously attacked a ship called the USS Liberty, which was an unarmed American spy ship under the NSA off the coast of Egypt in international waters. And it was flying an oversized American flag, and the Israeli pilots were flying over the ship. They'd been buzzing over it all morning long before the attack began. And then the attack began. They hit it with a torpedo in the middle, killing 34 Americans, and they bombed it, dropped napalm. And there was recently, or a couple years ago, the transcripts came out between the pilots and ground control. And the pilots' ground control in Tel Aviv said, identify the plane, identify the ship. And the planes called back and said, it's American, it's American. And then the command came from Tel Aviv, sink the ship, no survivors. So they intended to put this ship on the bottom of the ocean, but it was one of those old World War II Liberty hull ships, which have good compartments underneath, and it didn't go down. The torpedo went right in the middle of the ship and killed all of the guys down below with the headphones on that were interpreting the signal's intelligence. Killed all of them. But the ship didn't sink. But when the Americans tried to put life rafts into the water, the Israeli gunboats were machine gunning the life rafts. They had no intention. They intended the ship to go down the bottom, and had it gone to the bottom, it would have been blamed on Egypt. And this would have brought us very close to a nuclear war. But that's another story. This was Lyndon Johnson was in the White House, and he was very, very pro-Israel. And so twice, American planes were launched from aircraft carriers off the coast of Greece to rescue the ship. And twice, McNamara and Johnson called the planes back. He said, I will not embarrass an ally. So 171 Americans were brutally wounded on the ship and 34 killed. And that little piece of history is not generally well known in America because it's not taught. It's simply suppressed. So 7 countries in 5 years. This is General Wesley Clark. And he went to the Pentagon 10 days after 9/11, he said. And he said, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. And he said, one of the generals called me in and said, sir, we've made the decision we're going to war with Iraq. And he said, we're going to war with Iraq? Why? I don't know, he said. He said, I came back a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? He said, sir, it's much worse than that. We're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran. And he said this in March 2007 in several speeches. Now, you can see from that shopping list, 5 of those nations have already been done. Lebanon is already pretty much broken up along ethnic lines. And really the only one that's left is Iran. And you see with our current president, Donald Trump, he's very gung-ho, actually, in at least what he says, in waging war with Iran. Now, waging war with Iran would be disastrous for us and for the whole region, so I hope he doesn't do that. I hope he has enough sense to avoid that kind of thing. But this is the shopping list. Now, whose shopping list is this? What American interest is it? Wesley Clark was confused. What American interest is it in overthrowing these 7 Middle Eastern countries? Well, it's an Israeli plan, and it's called the Yinon Plan, named after the guy who wrote it, Oded Yinon. Oded Yinon published this in an Israeli magazine called Kivunim in 1982 in February. And Kivunim is the journal for Judaism and Zionism. It's published in Jerusalem by the World Zionist Organization. That's the very top of the Zionist enterprise. Like I said, that's the state of Israel. Zionism is the ideology upon which Israel is based. And the Yinon Plan, according to the man who translated Israel Shahak, a professor of chemistry, he said it represents the accurate and detailed plan of the present Zionist regime, the Likud, for the Middle East, which is based on the division of the whole area into small states and the dissolution of all existing Arab states. So what it means is something called Balkanization. You break up a country, a big country, and you reduce it to ethnic components, like what we've done in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a large socialist state, in southeastern Europe, and now today it's, I think, 7 little statelets. Iraq is de facto 3 states today. Kurdistan in the north, the ISIS area, Sunni area in the west, and the Shiite area in the south. Syria is very fragmented. Whether it stays that way or not, we'll see. Tripoli, Libya has been fractured into 2 or 3 pieces. Sudan is now de facto or de jure 2 countries, South Sudan and Sudan. Somalia is chaos. Yemen is chaos. The whole Middle East is chaotic. We don't see it that much because our media is more interested in manipulating our point of view than informing us of what's happening. But a day doesn't go by that some terrible atrocity doesn't happen in one of those countries. So this is the Yinon Plan. And thanks to Israel Shahak, a personal friend of mine, in 1982 he translated this document into English so that we would understand what the Zionist policy or plan was for the region. So after 9/11, the Israeli connection, of course, became more pronounced. And here you have at the White House, you have at the Pentagon, you have something called the Defense Policy Board. And the Defense Policy Board is a bunch of civilians, basically at that time neocons, Jewish neocons, who made policy for the Pentagon. And the head guy was Deputy Defense Minister Secretary Wolfowitz at the head of the table here, and across the table, smiling with the mustache, that's Rabbi Dov Zakheim, and he was the comptroller at the Pentagon. You might recall he was the man who said the day before, he was the comptroller of the funds. The day before 9/11, Rumsfeld told the public that there's missing $2.3 trillion, unaccountable, in the defense budget. That was on September 10th, 2001. He announced that. And sitting next to the Israeli man there, the Israeli man is the guy with the red beret. He's the Shaul Mofaz, an Iranian Jewish guy. And he was chief of staff. He's Israeli chief of staff. And here he is sharing notes, explaining to his Zionist colleagues at the Defense Department what they should do. And the man with something in his eye, that's Douglas Feith. Douglas Feith, his father was in the Irgun. He's an American, but his dad was in the Irgun. And because his father was an Israeli, he is also then an Israeli as well. And we see that this idea of supporting Israel's agenda, it was made very clear when Hillary Clinton wrote this email that was released about a year ago. Secretary of State Clinton wrote that in this memo, the best way to help Israel is to use force in Syria to overthrow the government. So that's why under Obama was spending $1 billion per year to run this covert operation. We, the Americans, have been funding all of those radical Islamist groups that have been causing chaos over there in Syria. They've been using pure terrorism, killing young men, pushing people off buildings, crucifying people, everything in the book to make it look really, really awful, to make Islam look really, really bad. This email from Hillary Clinton proves that Obama and Hillary were trying to overthrow the Syrian government because it was in Israel's interest, not ours. And you see, this devastation in Syria, we have to take ownership of this. We, as Americans, our government, fostered this. And it's caused a great deal of, half the country has been displaced. 11 million people out of a country of 25 million. And 4 million are living outside the country. A lot of my neighbors are from Syria. So 22 years after it was born in Jerusalem, the Israeli war on terror became operational after 9/11. So the purpose of 9/11 was to start this Israeli war agenda, this Zionist war agenda. And they used their agent here, Osama bin Laden, to impress upon us that he was the bad guy. So I'm going to talk about the Israeli connections to 9/11. And these are some points to show you that the Israeli connection to 9/11 and the Israeli connection to the war on terror, that both of these things come from the same place and for the same reason. First one is ideation, putting the idea out there of a 9/11 attack is possible. In 1978, Arnon Milchan, a senior Israeli intelligence agent, made his first movie called The Medusa Touch, in which a Boeing 747 goes into the Pan Am building in New York City. This is the cover of the book, and that's Arnon Milchan. So he made this. He's a very senior agent. He's involved in nuclear smuggling from the United States to Israel. And here he is talking to Ezra Weizmann in the same year he made the movie in England. Milchan with Ezra Weizmann, defense minister, 1978. So where did he get this idea of a 9/11 type attack? Where did this idea come from? Well, it was probably being planned already at that time, and I'll show you it was. So this is how they've set up the props to, the plane flying into the Pan Am building. Milchan is a very high Israeli agent. He's a top agent in a group called Lacham. Lacham, L-A-K-A-M, is actually the very secret organization that was set up to smuggle nuclear components to Israel from the United States. And he's worth something like $5 billion. He made JFK, he made Brazil, he made Pretty Woman. I think he made quite a few films. The movie Brazil is quite interesting. He made that one in 1986. It's a futuristic film in which terrorism happens all the time. and the nation that the people live in is fighting a war on terror against in some far-flung region. And in 2000, his business partner, Rupert Murdoch from Fox News, they made another film in which the World Trade Center was attacked by a plane. And in this case, it was a passenger aircraft that was remotely hijacked and flown into the World Trade Center. And Rupert Murdoch and Arnon Milchan are business partners. They have a television company together. So the idea probably came from Mr. Milchan. This was aired on Fox TV in March 2001. It was viewed by 13 million U.S. viewers 6 months before 9/11. Now, the father of Israeli intelligence, the man who was the founding chief of the Mossad for the first 15 years, this is this man, Isser Harel. And Isser Harel predicted in 1979 that Arabs would attack the tallest buildings in New York 22 years before it happened. He predicted it to this tall man here. His name is Michael Evans. He's a Zionist preacher from Texas. And you can see Mr. Evans is quite close to the Likud. He's good friends with Menachem Begin, the prime minister at the time. This is the prediction. In 1979, Mr. Evans was having dinner at Harel's house. So you see he's very highly connected. Not everybody has dinner at the Mossad chief's house. And he said, "Do you think terrorism will come to America? And if so, where and why?" And Isser Harel said, "I fear it will come to you in America. America has the power but not the will to fight terrorism. The terrorists have the will but not the power to fight America. But all that could change with time. Arab oil money buys more than tents." As to the where, Harel continued, "New York City is the symbol of freedom and capitalism. It's likely they will strike the Empire State Building, your tallest building, and a symbol of your power." So you can see that the prediction was there, the ideas were there, and then they put that plan into action. Then two of Isser Harel's top lieutenants from the Mossad, these older guys, they went to New York to get the security contract for the World Trade Center. And they got it in 1987. The president of the company was called Atwell Security of Tel Aviv. The head of the company was this Avraham Shalom, who was the former head of the Shin Bet. Now, Mr. Shalom had a little problem. In 1984, there had been a bus hijacking in Israel. Palestinians hijacked a bus on the coast. The Israeli forces went in there and got the people released, the passengers, and they caught two of the hijackers. And the agents in the field said, "Okay, we got these two Palestinian guys. What do we do with them?" He said, "Smash their heads with rocks." And that's what they did. And because of that command was an illegal command, it was not proper, Mr. Shalom Ben-Dor, Avram Shalom, was removed as head of Shin Bet. He lost his position, and he was looking for a new job. So he went to New York under Mossad and got a job in charge of security at the World Trade Center. Now, Atwell Security of Tel Aviv was the company that was set up to get the contract for the World Trade Center. What's key to understand here is that this name, Shaul Eisenberg, he's the billionaire guy, the big Mossad agent out in Asia. And he spends most of his time in Japan and China and whatnot. And he created this company for the sole purpose of getting the security contract for the World Trade Center. So these are the two characters who were involved in negotiations. Shalom Ben-Dor is on the bottom. But when the Port Authority discovered that Avraham Shalom was using a fake name and that he had this background as a murderer in Israel, convicted of murder, they tore up the security contract. They reneged on it. And that ended the contract. But had the contract gone through, 9/11 probably would have happened in the late 80s or maybe early 90s. And we would have been at a great disadvantage because we didn't have the internet. We had no way of really sharing information. But they were thwarted. These guys were Zvi Malkin on the top. And these are big agents of Isser Harel. They were involved, for example, in operations like when they went to Argentina and kidnapped Eichmann. These guys were involved in that. These guys were involved in smuggling plutonium from Pennsylvania to Israel for the nuclear weapons programs. So these are senior agents. And they came to New York for the sole purpose of getting the security contract for the World Trade Center. So the plan was moving forward. This is 1980s. When they were thwarted, when they were blocked by that tearing up of the contract, that didn't stop them. They went to work for these men. They went to work for Jules Kroll and Maurice Greenberg. You might remember Maurice Greenberg down here in the bottom picture. He's the man whose company, AIG, received a $180 billion bailout between the Bush and Obama administrations, right there on the threshold. Half went from Bush, half went from Obama. And he ran a criminal enterprise. His AIG insurance company was a criminal enterprise. He admitted it himself. He said, if we were legal, we wouldn't be in business. But, never mind. They also got control. They had a little company, Kroll Associates, the man Jules Kroll at the top. They had a company called Kroll Associates, which is like one of these security companies. And Kroll Associates got the security contract for the World Trade Center after the first bombing in 1993. You remember there was a bomb in the basement, 6 people were killed. Then they said, we need new security programs. So they went to Kroll Associates, and Avraham Shalom Ben-Dor was now working for Kroll. So, like in a Trojan horse method, he got in that way. Now, the fourth point is that Israel created the Islamic foe. They created the bad guy, the boogeyman, the other out there that we had to fear. And they did it during the early 80s when the Soviet Union, Red Army, had invaded Afghanistan. And then, of course, there were these Afghans who fled to Pakistan who needed arms. And the United States began arming these Pakistanis, or the Afghans in Pakistan, to go back and fight. But the only gang, the gang that got the lion's share of the money, was an anti-Western force called Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. Why? Here are these people in Afghanistan. They're protesting about this Gulbuddin. That's what he looks like. And they say imposing the vicious gang of Gulbuddin on our people is another crime of the U.S. government. It's true. It goes back to the 80s. But it wasn't just the Americans. Thousands of Arabs joined this group called Hezb Islami. This was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's group. They were extremely anti-Western. And at the time when they began funding this operation to arm these people, the money came from CIA and came from Saudi Arabia. These two hands were giving the money. But they were giving it to Israeli military intelligence, who was doing the arming and the training of this group. They were teaching them terrorism. They were teaching them how to make bombs, bicycles explode, and urban terrorism. And what happened is that these Arabs came to join with the Afghans fighting the Red Army in what's called a jihad. And in this Afghan Arab group, the most well-known one is Osama bin Laden. And in 1984, at exactly the time that Israeli military intelligence was training and arming these guys, here comes Osama bin Laden. So it was done in 1983, 84, and 85. That's when they began. And it was at the time that Israeli military intelligence was training these people, it was headed by none other than Ehud Barak. That's very important to understand. And it was done by, the program in America is understood through a movie called Charlie Wilson's War, or a book called Charlie Wilson's War. The movie's okay, but I really recommend reading the book. Because the movie doesn't explain the Israeli connection. You don't understand anything about the Israeli connection. If you read the book, you will see that this entire thing was actually being run by the Mossad. And Charlie Wilson was just like their puppet. He was like doing what they were telling him to do. And he was going to be famous. So Charlie Wilson was the congressman who arranged for the CIA to give the money for the Israeli weapons. And so this is Gulbuddin Hekmatyar down below and Charlie Wilson shaking hands. But the question is, why would the CIA and Israeli military intelligence arm and train the most virulently anti-Western mujahideen? It makes no sense. It's like, why would you do that? Well, because they were creating for the enemy for the next war. They were creating the boogeyman for the war on terror. Here's the connection, very simple. Zvi Rafia, the man down below, was Mossad station chief in Washington. When Charlie Wilson was elected down in Texas in 1973, he fell under this man's into his domain, and they became very good friends. And whenever Charlie Wilson went to Israel, Zvi Rafia took care of all of his meetings, who he would see, what he would talk to. He was being taken around. And in the book, it says that Zvi Rafia, Mossad station chief, used Charlie Wilson's congressional office as if it were his own. Now, if you've ever been to a congressional office, you know it's big. A congressional office takes about the size of half this library because they have lots and lots of rooms. And they have lots and lots of stuff, people working there, communications, etc. In the book, it says this: Rafia always acted as if he owned Wilson's office. One of the staffers kept a list of people he needed to lobby. He would use the phones, give projects to the staff, and call on Charlie to intervene whenever he needed him. So he was using American workers, interns and whatnot in the congressman's office to work for Israeli intelligence. Aren't they clever? And here's Osama bin Laden's first trainer. This is a very interesting story. I can't go into great detail. The man's name is Ali Muhammad, 1M. It's not misspelled. That's Ali Muhammad. And you'll read about this guy. There's a lot written about him. He's a Hebrew-speaking Egyptian. Now, I can tell you, I've lived in Egypt and I lived in Israel. You don't learn Hebrew in Egypt. So he learned Hebrew on the job. And he's probably a triple agent. He was the first trainer for Osama bin Laden. He also set up the cell in Nairobi that bombed the U.S. embassies in Africa. He also trained the men who bombed the World Trade Center. He also trained the men who shot Rabbi Kahana. He was involved in everything. And this man was finally put in prison in a federal penitentiary in this country for his involvement in bombing the African embassies, the embassies in Africa. And from the federal penitentiary, he simply vanished without a trace. And here, Gulbuddin becomes Al-Qaeda. In 1994, after losing Saudi and Pakistani support, the remainder of Hezb Islami merged into Al-Qaeda and Taliban. Taliban is basically the Afghans, the Pashtuns, and Al-Qaeda is the Arab-speaking. So these are the people who were trained by Israeli military intelligence. They became Al-Qaeda. So then the next point is that, after that bombing in the World Trade Center in 1993 in February, the case became a Zionist case again. The prosecutor was Michael Chertoff and other Zionists. Michael Chertoff was the chief guy in New Jersey because the conspiracy happened in New Jersey. And it fell into the court of his fellow Zionist judge, Michael Mukasey. And what they did is, this was a very odd case, but what they were doing is they were framing our mind that we would understand that Arabs were trying to bring down the World Trade Center, that this was an Arab plot, when in fact it wasn't an Arab plot at all. Even if you read the New York Times, you'll see that it was a complete setup. It went like this. February 1993, the first false bombing hit the World Trade Center in the basement. It caused a lot of damage, but it didn't go anywhere near bringing the buildings down. 6 people were killed, and as I said, Chertoff and Mukasey framed the case against the blind sheikh. Now here's the blind sheikh smiling back there with the sunglasses on, and he's being led out of the room by a man named Ahmad Salem. Ahmad Salem was an Egyptian colonel who came to this country and was involved working with the FBI as the informant. He was the FBI's informant. So he was getting into his circle men who could be held responsible for the crime that was going to happen. And that's what he did. He was paid Ahmad Salem was paid $1 million for his testimony. Michael Chertoff played a key role in the prosecution. So what happened is that these innocent Muslims, like the blind sheikh, were sent away to jail for like 5,000 years. This guy took his $1 million and went into the witness protection program and lives happily ever after. But there are tapes of him talking to the FBI about making the bomb and who made the bomb, who's going to blow up the bomb. And you can tell from his voice that he feels very dismayed at the way the whole thing turned out in the end. Of course he did. Then the Zionist plans for revamping the American military required something called the New Pearl Harbor. This is before 9/11 still. There was a series of articles and ideas, think tanks that called for a new Pearl Harbor. One of the most important ones is this one. This was in the Foreign Affairs magazine, which is a CFR publication. It was written as the report of what's called a study group. Philip Zelikow had a catastrophic terrorism study group. And in his study group was Ashton Carter. That name might be familiar, Secretary of Defense under Obama, and John Deutsch, former head of the CIA. And they had this catastrophic terrorism study group for a year or so, and then they produced this report. And as you can see from the beginning of the article, they were imagining the transforming event. They were imagining that event that would change this country, that act of catastrophic terrorism. This is in 1998, December. They were imagining this tremendous catastrophe that would change America forever. And this paper was basically laying out, when that happens, what we would have to do. This is like think tank material. Here are the two of the men that wrote it, along with Philip Zelikow. They are at the top left, Ashton Carter, and the man with the blue sweater in the middle, that's John Deutsch. They worked for a company at the time called Global Technology Partners, which is an exclusive affiliate of Rothschild North America. Now, you'll hear throughout this presentation many times Rothschild, because what you find is that in almost every case, the entity that's doing the dirty work is owned by the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds are 2 or 3 steps back, but they're always part of the picture, but they're like behind the scenes. And of course, the Rothschild North America owns this company because they make acquisitions and investments in technology, defense, and aerospace-related companies. Because that $2.5 trillion has to be spent somewhere. Somebody has to take it home at the end of the day. And they want to be the one to take it home. So again, this is another group called the Project for a New American Century. And 1 year before 9/11, they came out with a paper called Rebuilding America's Defenses. Again, it's a policy paper, how America should be in the paper it said that the United States should invade Iraq and build permanent bases in Iraq, whether Saddam Hussein is there or not. And then they call this transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, America being the police of the whole world, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. 1 year before. If you recall the debates in the year 2000, in the presidential election of 2000, George Bush was asked several times,